Hi, Moriah from Mogility here. In this YouTube channel for Mogility, we'll walk through safe and other Agile topics. In this video, we'll dive into story points. A common complaint I've seen amongst Agile teams is, why are we even doing story points? They seem a bit pointless. So let's dive into that. For us to get into more information about story points and why we're doing them, it's important to understand how stories themselves predict the point. So the components of a story itself actually end up making the story point value. And whenever you think about that, you want to think, what the VUC? Because VUC stands for volume, uncertainty, complexity, and knowledge. Let's dive into those topics a bit further. Volume is how much work is the particular item. So is this a lot of work? Is this just a little bit of work? Or is the amount of work unknown? If it's just a little bit of work, it's a small point. If it's a lot of work or if it's unknown to the team, it's a larger point. Uncertainty is how much of the work that needs to be done do you have questions about? When you look at the work outlined, does it bring up a lot of questions or very little to none? If there's very little questions, it's probably a smaller point. If there's a lot of questions, generally it's a larger point. And then that brings us to complexity. So how difficult is the process to complete the work? Will the work cause issues or ripple effects in other areas? Is the process of pushing the work to a production environment very convoluted? Is the testing process difficult or unknown? And then last but not least is knowledge. How much do you know about the request? Do you feel pretty confident in what is required to get the work completed? Or do you feel like you have a knowledge gap, whether it be in technology or just a general understanding? If you have a lot of knowledge on the particular topic, it's a smaller point. If you have very little understanding, it's a larger point. And the next thing that we want to talk about is the Fibonacci sequence. So the Fibonacci sequence has been modified for scaled Agile and Agile practitioners. But the Fibonacci sequence didn't start with Agile. It started back in BC, 400 to 1200 BC, where it was introduced by Indian mathematics and then was more thoroughly defined later by an Italian mathematician named Leonardo of Pisa. But when they introduced this concept, it brought in this recurrence relation. So recurrence relation is being able to look at values and seeing that the new value is equal to some part of the previous value. So the example would be 0 plus 1 equals 1. And then for the next sequence, you would take the 1 from the previous value and say 1 plus 1, that equals 2. And then the 2 plus 1 equals 3. And then looking at the numbers above, you would say the 3 plus 2 equals 5, and the 5 plus 3 equals 8, and the 8 plus 5 equals 13. But then when you get here, this is where it's modified. So that's where the modification takes place for the Scaled Agile framework. And quite frankly, from my experience, anytime we have a story that is at an 8 or above, that's generally indication the story is too large to take into a sprint or into an iteration, whichever word you use. But it's important to understand the Fibonacci sequence and why it's utilized. It's not just about the history. It's not just about the points adding up and equaling a portion of the value from the previous value. It's really understanding that it's all about relativity. So if you have 4 stories and you know clearly one of them is a 1 because it's the smallest VUC, then you then can look at your other stories, the other 3 stories, and you can compare those and say, okay, well, are they larger? If they're larger, which clearly we've already identified that this one is the smallest, but there might be one of equal value. So you might have a couple of 1s, and then you might have a 3 and a 5. But if, like I said, if one of them was an 8 or above, my recommendation would be to break those down, which we will have videos coming up about how to break down stories and make them more consumable. Okay, so nice history lesson. Thank you, Moriah. But why does it matter? Why do we use story points? The history is important, but knowing why we do it, I think, is even more important. And the why is really around trust. And I know that might sound cliche, but if you are in IT, if you're in software development, your job is to provide something to end users, whether that's people within your own organization or that's people, customers who are purchasing products from your company. If we can build a bridge between the teams and the end users built on trust, then everyone's more satisfied. But that satisfaction comes from being predictive. So if we can look at story points as a measure over time and provide some predictability to our end users, they're much more satisfied with our products because they know that if we say we're going to get something done in Q3, we'll have it done in Q3. This does start off rocky, but the whole team needs to buy into the concept of story points and why we have story points. And then somebody on the team, usually a scrum master, then evaluates the sprints and identifies any patterns. So that way the team can start seeing those patterns and be better at those story point values going forward. I hope this video was helpful. Again, this is Mogility, and we are providing helpful content in regard to Agile and SAFe.